The air tasted stale and metallic as Elias Mercer stepped off the transport shuttle onto the desolate surface of Thalassa 7. The moon's atmosphere was technically breathable, but thin enough that his lungs ached with each breath. Above him, a gas giant loomed impossibly large, its swirling storms casting an eerie greenish glow across the rocky terrain. "Welcome to the edge of civilization, Mr. Mercer," droned the automated message in his helmet. "Please proceed directly to decontamination." Elias hefted his equipment bag and trudged toward the research station, a collection of gleaming white domes connected by transparent tubes that looked absurdly pristine against the barren landscape. After 6 months in transit, he was beyond ready for a real shower and a bed that didn't vibrate with engine noise. The airlock cycled with a hiss and he stepped into the station's main hub. That's when he first saw her. She stood motionless by the monitoring station, tall and slender with a posture so perfect it looked uncomfortable. Her skin was the color of polished copper with a subtle iridescence that shifted under the harsh station lights. Large, dark eyes observed him with clinical detachment, set in a face that seemed deliberately composed to reveal nothing. "You are the human engineer," she stated, not a question. "Elias Mercer," he replied, extending his hand before remembering the cultural briefing about Sevorians. He awkwardly lowered it. "Sorry, I forgot that you don't do that." "Correct, physical contact is not practiced among my kind." Her voice was melodic but carefully modulated, as if each word was measured before being released. "I am Vexia, lead researcher for the Thalassan Atmospheric Anomaly Project." She wore what appeared to be a uniform, a high-collared, seamless garment that covered everything except her face and hands. Her hands, Elias noticed, had 6 long fingers with an extra joint, currently clasped behind her back in what he'd come to recognize as the standard Sevorian pose of professional attention. "The station director sent me to provide your orientation," Vexia continued. "You will be assisting with the environmental control systems. They have been problematic." "That's what I'm here for," Elias said, trying for a friendly smile. 6 months of travel to fix your air conditioning must be important." No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement at his attempt at humor. "Your quarters are in Section C," she said, turning smoothly to lead the way. "We maintain a temperature gradient that accommodates both species, though you may find it cool by human standards." As they walked, Elias noticed the deliberate distance she maintained, always precisely 2 meters ahead of him, adjusting her pace whenever he closed the gap. The station was surprisingly quiet, with only the hum of machinery breaking the silence. "How many people are stationed here?" he asked. "3 Sevorians including myself and now 2 humans including you," she replied without turning. "Dr. Ockhaffer is in the geology lab. Your schedules have been synchronized to optimize workspace efficiency." The corridors were spotless, with not a single personal item visible. No photos, no decorations, nothing to suggest that living beings occupied this space. "You'll be working primarily with me on the station's environmental systems," Vexia explained as they reached his quarters. "The anomalous atmosphere of Thalassa 7 causes unpredictable failures in our equipment. Your expertise is required." Elias thought he detected a slight hesitation before that last word, a tiny crack in her perfect composure. "Interesting." "I look forward to working with you," he said, meaning it. Despite her coldness, there was something fascinating about her. Vexia inclined her head slightly. "We begin at 600 station time. Rest adequately." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps perfectly measured, her copper skin catching the light as she disappeared around a corner. Elias sighed and entered his quarters. It would be a long 6 months. 3 weeks into his assignment, Elias had established a routine. Each morning, he'd arrive at the Environmental Control Center to find Vexia already working, her copper fingers dancing across holographic interfaces with remarkable precision. She never seemed to sleep more than a few hours and never arrived after him, not once. "The primary filtration unit is showing a 3.2% decline in efficiency," Vexia announced as he entered, not bothering with greetings. Sevorians didn't do pleasantries. "I've compiled the data here." Elias leaned over her shoulder to examine the readings, careful to maintain what he'd mentally termed Sevorian personal space, approximately 60 centimeters. Even at this distance, he could detect the faint scent that seemed unique to her species, something like cinnamon and ozone. Looks like particle buildup in the secondary chambers, he said. We should be able to flush it with a controlled purge. Vexia tilted her head slightly. That approach risks temporary pressure imbalance in adjacent sections. True, but it's faster than a full disassembly, Elias grinned. Sometimes efficiency requires a calculated risk. Something flickered across her features, so subtle he might have imagined it. Curiosity, perhaps. Your species embraces risk as a methodology, she observed. It is different from our approach. Different doesn't mean wrong, Elias replied, moving to the maintenance console. How much do you know about humans anyway? We can't all be as impulsive as your cultural briefings probably suggest. Vexia was silent for a moment. Her large eyes blinking in that slow, deliberate way that he'd learned, indicated she was considering her words carefully. I know that humans require significant physical proximity to maintain psychological health, she said finally. You touch regularly. You seek emotional connections. These behaviors would be considered signs of severe dysfunction among my people. Elias paused his work. And you've never wondered what that's like, to touch someone else? The question hung in the air between them. For the first time, Vexia looked genuinely uncomfortable. Such curiosity would be inappropriate, she replied, her voice slightly faster than its usual measured pace. Sevorians are taught from birth that physical and emotional distance preserves clarity of thought, logic above all else. Sounds lonely, Elias said softly. Loneliness is an emotional state, she countered. We do not experience it as you do. But there was something in her voice that made Elias wonder if that was entirely true. The days passed in similar fashion, professional cooperation punctuated by these small moments where cultural differences created tiny windows into each other's worlds. Elias found himself looking forward to these glimpses beneath Vexia's composed exterior. One evening, as they worked late calibrating the atmospheric processors, he noticed her watching his hands as he manipulated the delicate components. Is something wrong? He asked. Your manual dexterity is remarkable despite having only 5 digits, she observed. I've been studying the efficiency of your movements. Elias laughed. That's the nicest compliment I've gotten about my hands. Vexia blinked. It was not a compliment, merely an observation. Still taking it as a win, he said with a shrug. Later, as they finished their work, Elias stretched his arms overhead, his back cracking audibly after hours hunched over equipment. Vexia flinched at the sound. Sorry, he said. Human joints make noise sometimes. Your physiology is perplexing, she replied. Then, with what almost sounded like hesitation, does that process relieve discomfort? The stretching, yeah, feels amazing after being still too long. Vexia nodded once, filing away this information like everything else she learned about humans. Efficient rest promotes optimal function. You should proceed to your quarters. It wasn't until he was halfway back to his room that Elias realized. In her own way, Vexia had expressed concern for his well-being. The alarms blared at 2:47 station time, jerking Elias from a dreamless sleep. Red warning lights pulsed across his quarters as the station's AI announced in multiple languages. Critical system failure. Emergency protocols activated. Proceed to designated safety zones. Elias stumbled into his environmental suit, not the full pressure suit, but the insulated emergency gear kept in each quarter, and hurried into the corridor. The station's temperature was already dropping rapidly. He could see his breath fogging in front of him. Status report, he shouted into his communicator as he ran toward the environmental control center. Primary and secondary power systems compromised, came the voice of Dr. Ockefer from the geology lab. I'm reading massive power surges across all grids. Something hit us, maybe a micrometeorite swarm. Elias rounded the corner and nearly collided with Vexia, who was moving with uncharacteristic haste toward the same destination. The environmental systems are failing, she stated, her usual composure intact despite the crisis. Backup protocols have not engaged properly. Together, they rushed into the control center, where holographic displays showed cascading failures throughout the station. Outside the reinforced windows, Elias could see the storm that had been brewing in Thalassa 7's thin atmosphere for days had finally broken. Violent winds hurled ice particles against the station's exterior with alarming force. We need to manually reset the environmental core, Elias said, already moving toward the sealed chamber that housed the main control unit. If we don't get life support back online, we'll freeze before help arrives. Vexia nodded once and followed him. They reached the chamber door just as another violent impact rocked the station. The lights flickered ominously, then died completely, leaving only the dim emergency strips along the floor. Implementing manual override, Vexia said, her six-fingered hands working the mechanical backup system. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. They entered the chamber and had barely begun work on the control unit when a deafening crack echoed through the station, followed by the terrifying sound of rapid depressurization somewhere distant. "Station integrity compromised," announced the AI. "Emergency bulkheads engaged." The heavy doors of the control chamber slammed shut with finality, sealing them inside. Elias rushed to the intercom. "Akafer, can you hear me?" Static, then a broken response. "Sealed off emergency beacon, rescue team from the main colony, days to reach." Then silence. Vexia stood perfectly still, her iridescent skin reflecting the dim emergency lights. "We are trapped," she observed, her voice maintaining its even tone despite the direness of their situation. "And the environmental systems in this section are failing." Elias checked the internal diagnostics panel. Temperatures dropping fast. Without the heating elements, this chamber will reach sub-zero within hours. "The rescue team will require approximately 72 hours to reach us," Vexia calculated, her breath now visible in the increasingly frigid air. "Our survival prospects are concerning." Elias searched the chamber for anything that might help. There were no emergency blankets, no additional heating units, nothing designed for human or Sevorian survival in extreme cold. The chamber had never been intended as a shelter. "We have one option," he said finally, turning to face Vexia, "and you're not going to like it." Part 4 shared warmth. 4 hours later, the temperature in the sealed chamber had plummeted to -5 degrees Celsius. The cold bit through Elias' emergency suit, which had never been designed for prolonged exposure to such temperatures. His extremities had gone from painful to worryingly numb. Across the small space, Vexia sat rigidly against the wall, her copper skin taking on a dull, matte quality. Though Sevorians evolved on a cooler world than Earth, they were no more adapted to these freezing conditions than humans. Her breathing had become shallow, her movements increasingly sluggish. "This isn't working," Elias said through chattering teeth. "We need to share body heat or we're not going to make it through the night." Vexia's large eyes fixed on him with obvious alarm. "Physical contact is—" "I know," he interrupted. "It's taboo for your people, but right now it's also our only chance of survival." A visible conflict played across her usually composed features. "Our cultural prohibitions exist for important psychological reasons," she said, her voice hardly above a whisper. "Sevorians experience overwhelm from direct contact. It is why we are taught from birth to avoid it." Elias nodded, trying to understand. "What kind of overwhelm?" "Neural feedback, sensory input our minds are not trained to process." She hesitated. "It is considered a vulnerability, a weakness of focus and control." "But not physically harmful." "No," she admitted, "merely intense." Another violent shiver racked Elias' body. The environmental displays showed the temperature still dropping. "Look," he said gently, "I'm not asking you to break your cultural taboos lightly, but we have maybe 6 hours before hypothermia becomes fatal. This is about survival." Vexia was silent for a long moment, her internal struggle evident despite her training. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Acceptable," she said, "for survival purposes only." Elias moved carefully to her side of the chamber and settled beside her against the wall. Even this proximity, shoulders nearly touching, seemed to cause her visible tension. "I'll follow your lead," he said softly. "We can start with minimal contact." Hesitantly, Vexia extended one six-fingered hand. Elias gently took it in his own. Her skin was cold but smoother than he expected, with a subtle texture like fine suede. The moment their hands connected, Vexia drew in a sharp breath. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating dramatically. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, concerned. "It is more intense than I anticipated," she replied, her voice unsteady for the first time since he'd met her. but not unmanageable, continue. Gradually, cautiously, they shifted closer until they sat side by side, shoulders and hips touching. Each new point of contact seemed to send visible waves of sensation through Vexia, but she did not pull away. As the hours passed and the temperature dropped further, they moved by wordless agreement into a closer embrace. Elias wrapped his arms around her slender form, and after a moment's hesitation, she curled against his chest. "Your heartbeat," she murmured, sounding almost dazed. "I can feel it through your chest wall. It's rhythmic." "That's generally considered a good thing," Elias said with a weak laugh. They fell silent, conserving energy as they huddled together in the dimly lit chamber. Elias felt Vexia gradually relax against him, her initial rigidity slowly melting away as her body acclimated to the unprecedented sensation of being held. Near what must have been dawn, though they had no way to tell time, Elias realized that Vexia's breathing had changed. Looking down, he saw something impossible, a single glistening tear tracking down her copper cheek. "What is it?" he whispered. "I never knew," she said simply, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. "In all my studies of other species, I never understood this." The rescue team arrived 39 hours after the system failure, breaking through the sealed chamber door in a rush of warm air and bright lights. Elias and Vexia were found huddled together in the corner, both alive but weak from cold and hunger. "Cutting it close, aren't you?" Elias joked weakly as the medics wrapped thermal blankets around them. In the chaos of medical checks and system repairs, he lost track of Vexia. She was whisked away by the Sevorian medical officer while Elias was treated for moderate hypothermia and exhaustion. By the time he was released to his quarters, the station was humming with activity as repair crews worked to restore full functionality. For 3 days, he didn't see her at all. When Elias finally returned to the Environmental Control Center, he found another Sevorian, Nalax, one of the junior researchers, manning Vexia's usual station. "Where is she?" Elias asked. Nalax's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested discomfort. "Lead researcher Vexia has requested temporary reassignment to the analytical laboratory." Elias felt a pang of disappointment he hadn't expected. "Is she all right?" "Her physical condition is adequate," Nalax replied in typical Sevorian fashion, revealing nothing about her emotional state, if such a thing could even be discussed among her people. That evening, after his shift ended, Elias found himself wandering toward the observation dome, a rarely used section of the station with a transparent ceiling offering views of the gas giant that dominated Thalassa 7's sky. To his surprise, a slender figure stood alone in the dimness, copper skin reflecting the swirling storms above. "I thought Sevorians didn't appreciate scenic views," he said quietly as he approached. Vexia didn't turn, but her posture changed subtly, a tension that hadn't been there before. "We appreciate patterns and symmetry. The atmospheric turbulence creates both." Elias stood beside her, careful to maintain what had once been their normal distance. "You've been avoiding me." "Yes," she admitted simply. "Because of what happened in the chamber." Vexia turned to face him then, her large eyes reflecting the ghostly light from above. "What happened in the chamber has complicated matters." "How so?" Her hands, usually clasped behind her back, moved restlessly at her sides. "I find myself experiencing sensory echo, physiological memory of contact. It is distracting." "You miss it," Elias translated, "being touched." "Such a response would be considered deeply inappropriate among my people," she said, her voice barely audible. "We are taught that physical independence is fundamental to intellectual clarity." "And now you're questioning that?" Vexia moved closer to him, just slightly but deliberately. "I have always excelled at controlling my responses, at maintaining distance. Now I find myself," she paused, searching for words, "incomplete, as if something essential was shown to me and then withdrawn." With careful slowness, Elias extended his hand, palm up between them, an offer, not a demand. Vexia stared at it for a long moment. Then, with what seemed like tremendous courage, she placed her six-fingered hand in his. "This is not logical," she whispered. "No," Elias agreed, "but maybe there's more to life than logic." They stood together beneath the swirling storms of the gas giant, hands entwined, as Vexia tentatively leaned her head against his shoulder. In the reflection of the dome's transparent ceiling, they made a strange silhouette, human and Sevorian, two beings whose peoples had evolved light years apart, now finding connection in the simplest of gestures. "What happens now?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Elias admitted. "We have 4 more months on this station. We'll figure it out together." Vexia's fingers tightened around his. "My people have a concept called K-Saurath, the space between stars. It refers to the apparent emptiness that is actually filled with invisible forces connecting distant bodies. Like gravity. Like this," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Invisible but undeniably present." Outside, the eternal storm raged on across the face of the gas giant. Inside, in the quiet space between two very different beings, something new and fragile took root and began to grow. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. 3.7 Sonnet.